Hi everyone. I'm going to do this notes PowerPoint on photosynthesis. We just finished our looking at the cycles of the earth. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to take a deeper dive and look at the process that plants use to make their own food. So the first thing that I want to talk about is where organisms get energy. And so this should be review for you. You should already know that ultimately in every ecosystem, energy comes directly from the sun, which is then absorbed by producers, okay? And then after that, it cycles through the ecosystem because consumers are going to eat producers and so on and so forth, okay? So basically what those producers or autotrophs are doing is they are converting solar energy into a simple sugar. So once again, review, autotrophs are organisms that are going to make their own food, also known as producers, and heterotrophs are organisms that cannot make their own food and must eat it, known as consumers. And so I included a couple of adorable pictures of animals and this one really weird looking elephant because it made me laugh. So what really is photosynthesis? To sum up, because it is a very complex process, photosynthesis is a series of chemical reactions where the product of one reaction is consumed by the next reaction and so on and so forth. And we refer to that as a biochemical pathway because it's not just one reaction, it's several, and it's happening in a living organism. So it's a biochemical pathway. To break down the term photosynthesis, because if you remember in class, I was saying that it's very helpful to understand root words in this class. The root photo means light, and the root synthesis means to make. So if you're really looking at photosynthesis, what you're reading is light to make. So that should make sense to you because what photosynthesis is a cycle that takes place in green plants and algae where sugars and oxygen are produced using the energy from sunlight. So we're using light to make these things, to make sugars and oxygen. So that's where that term is coming from. Okay? So continuing on, we can get a little bit more specific with photosynthesis because I am 100% sure that all of you have at least heard the term photosynthesis before, but you haven't really taken a deep dive into what it actually is and how it's actually going to work. So we have two stages that goes on in photosynthesis. We have the light-dependent reactions that happen. Those are dependent upon light being present. They need light to work. So if light is absent, these are not going to take place, okay? The light-dependent reactions are where light energy is being absorbed by the chloroplasts and converted into chemical energy. That chemical energy is temporarily going to be stored in something called ATP and NADPH. So those two things have very long, complicated names, which I provided for you. ATP is known as adenosine triphosphate, and NADPH is nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide phosphate hydrogen. So you can probably see why we like to abbreviate those because nobody wants to say nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide phosphate hydrogen every single time they have to reference that chemical because that's long. So we call them ATP and NADPH. So once again, energy is being stored in these molecules as a result of your light-dependent reaction. The other part of photosynthesis is the light-independent reaction. So this is also known as the Calvin cycle, and this can happen whether or not light is present. So for the first part, we needed light to kickstart that reaction, but for this one, light does not have to be present for this to take place, okay? And in the Calvin cycle, organic compounds, so if you guys remember, organic compounds means something that contains carbon. Anything that contains carbon is going to be an organic compound or an organic molecule. So this cycle forms organic compounds or compounds that have carbon using carbon dioxide and that energy that was stored in our ATP and our NADPH. So what this entire thing is doing is it's using the products of the light-dependent reactions to continue on and then finally make your organic compounds using that stuff, okay? So a little bit more complicated. This that you're looking at right here is the overall equation for photosynthesis. So this equation here is a summary of the entire thing. It is not the complete equation because there are several chemical reactions that actually happen and a lot more products than I have time to list right now. But this is the overall equation, what's going in and what's going out, okay? So let's break this down. We have first 6H2O. So you're probably familiar with H2O already, you know it's water. So we have 6 water molecules reacting with 6 CO2 molecules and sunlight. So sunlight is sometimes listed in the reactant side or the left side of the equation. Sometimes it's kind of just drawn in as a little sun over the little arrow because sunlight is needed to trigger this reaction to happen. So because sunlight is a form of energy. So that energy is causing these molecules to react with one another and things to happen. Okay, so once again, we have 6 waters and 6 carbon dioxides going in and reacting with one another. And then on the other side, after all those reactions happen, coming out the other side, we have a glucose molecule, C6H12O6, and 6 oxygen molecules, okay? So really quickly, I just want to point out something to you. The reason that we need 6 waters, 6 carbon dioxides, and 6 oxygens is because of something called the law of conservation of mass, which basically says that matter can neither be created nor destroyed, only rearranged. So we could not create something from nothing or conversely destroy something. We have to move it around. So if you were to actually go and count the number of hydrogens, the number of oxygens, and the number of carbons in this reaction, you would find that total we have 12 hydrogens on this side, and we have 12 hydrogens on this side. We would have 6 carbons on this side and 6 carbons on that side, and we would have 18 oxygens on this side and 18 oxygens on that side. And that everything is the same because we haven't created or destroyed anything. We've only moved it around to form different products and different molecules. So I just wanted to point that out because science and any chemical reaction has to follow the law of conservation of mass. And if ever you're looking at a reaction and it does not make sense in the terms that something's disappearing or moving around and you don't know where it went, you're probably doing it wrong. So I just wanted to point that out really quickly. Here is a nice other representation, it's a little bit neater, of the photosynthesis reaction. So you're seeing here the sun is not described as one of the reactants, but it is the energy that's fueling the reaction. So it's part of it, but it's not matter, it's energy, okay? But I want to talk now about where exactly photosynthesis is going to take place. And it takes place in the chloroplasts in the leaves of plants. So this drawing here is a representation of what a chloroplast looks like. And then this picture here is actually a picture that I took through the lens of a regular light microscope, which I was very, very happy when I was able to take this picture because you usually, to see anything under a microscope, need to dye it. You need to put a dye on it so that you can see it because a lot of things are fairly clear and not easy to see under a microscope. But each of these little tiny green dots, that's a chloroplast that's popping up. So I was able to see those green chloroplasts pop up without dyeing my sample, which was really cool. So that's what those are, and that's what it might look like under a microscope without dyeing it. This over here, we have a few things to notice. So we have an outer and an inner membrane, in each chloroplast. We have an aqueous or a liquid space inside the chloroplast. We have each of these little discs looking things. Those are thylakoids, and then the stack of those discs is going to be referred to as a granum or a granum. So photosynthesis is going to take place in these, in every single plant that does photosynthesis. So once again, we're summarizing. Stroma is going to be the aqueous or the liquid space inside the chloroplast. I highly recommend that around the word aqueous in your notes, you make a note and say liquid, because you've probably never heard the term aqueous before. So to remember that that means the liquid space in the chloroplast, you're going to write the word liquid next to it. The thylakoid is going to be the site of the light-dependent reaction of photosynthesis. So those little discs are where the light-dependent reaction happens, or the reaction that needs light to happen. And then once again, the granum is the stack of thylakoids. This picture here is super, super important. So this picture could theoretically show up on one of your exams. I might ask you to label some things in this picture. So my recommendation to you right now is to pause the video and copy down a sketch of this picture, because you need to know that this thing over here is one of the places where a light-dependent reaction might happen. So this stack, this entire granum stack, is a stack of thylakoids. So water's going in, light's going in, oxygen is coming out of there. I might ask you, NADP and ADP are going in here, and ATP and NADPH are coming out of this little circuitous process right here. I might ask you what this is here, coming in and feeding into the Calvin cycle and then producing a sugar down here. I might ask you, what's this that's going into the light reaction? I might ask you, what's this going into the light reaction? I might ask you, what's coming out down here? I might ask you, what's coming out down here? I might ask you, what's this cycle called right here? I might ask you what this is called. So again, I need for you to pause the video right now and sketch this, or take a picture of it or something, because you are going to need to be able to recognize these things on an exam. But moving on, what happens in the light-dependent reaction? So pigments are going to capture light energy, which must be converted to chemical energy, which is temporarily stored as that ATP, NADPH, and oxygen gas is given off as a result of that. So to just go back for a second and summarize, that is what you are seeing off to the left here. So like this entire half here is what's happening in the light-dependent reaction. We get that solar energy coming in on the left, water coming into it as well. We see that ATP and NADPH are produced as a result of this, and oxygen is given off as a waste. So this entire half is your light-dependent reaction, okay? So moving forward, once again, that's all this is summarizing for you. In the light-independent reaction, otherwise known as the Calvin cycle, plants are using that atmospheric carbon dioxide and the energy that was stored in your light-dependent reaction to produce sugars. Another term for this is the carbon fixation part of photosynthesis. So once again, I'm going to go back a couple of slides and highlight that for you on this picture that you need to be able to identify stuff on. So this half of it is your light-independent reaction, the reaction that does not need light to take place directly, okay? So we have the Calvin cycle using that atmospheric CO2 and producing out a sugar. And as a result of that, we get our NADP plus and our ADP, adenosine diphosphate, and the nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide phosphate without that extra hydrogen on it, but that's less important for us to know right now. But the key things here that you need to pay attention to is 1, doesn't need light, 2, uses carbon dioxide, 3, makes a sugar. Those are the things that I need you to know about the Calvin cycle. To continue on a little bit, many plants are going to produce extra carbohydrates, which can be stored as starch in the chloroplasts and in the roots and fruits. So those are going to provide chemical energy that autotrophs and heterotrophs, so producers and consumers, are going to depend on, and you eat those all the time. Potatoes, like anything you would see in this picture right here, any of those are those stored carbohydrates that plants produce for themselves, and we eat those to attain energy. So once again, where does the Calvin cycle occur? The Calvin cycle is going to occur in the stroma, or in the liquid part of your chloroplast. So once again, in your granum and your thylakoids, that's where your light reaction is happening. Then in the liquid part surrounding that, that's where your Calvin cycle is happening. Carbon fixation I want to talk about because it does relate directly to the cycles that we've already talked about in class. It's a complicated way to say that a plant is taking carbon dioxide and turning it into a sugar, because it's taking that atmospheric CO2 and it's making it into a chemical that is not in the atmosphere anymore. So taking our atmospheric CO2, turning it into the glucose sugar. There are a few types of ways that carbon could be fixed into a non-atmospheric form. The Calvin cycle is one of them, which is the most common pathway in which that happens. It's gonna be called that because of the 3 carbon sugar that is produced out of it, but I'm not super worried that you know why it's called what it is. I'm just worried that you know that the Calvin cycle is one of the ways to fix carbon, or to affix it in a chemical form. I briefly do want to list a couple of things that are going to affect photosynthesis. So looking at this graph, and I know you guys need practice with reading graphs, so we're going to analyze this a little bit. Looking at this, light intensity is going to affect photosynthesis. So on the left over here, we have, looking at this, we have our light intensity as our X variable, or our independent variable as a reminder, and we have our rate of photosynthesis as our Y, or our dependent variable. And those are easy to identify, not only because you find them on the X and Y axis, but because light intensity is not something that depends on how fast photosynthesis is happening. Photosynthesis depends on how strong your light is, okay? So we see over here, if there's no light, then photosynthesis is not happening, because part of photosynthesis depends on light being present. And then as that light goes up in intensity, we see the rate of photosynthesis increasing and increasing and increasing until we see it leveling off here. Now, the reason that it does not increase indefinitely into infinity is because photosynthesis can only happen so fast. There's only so many chloroplasts in a plant. So at a certain point, they're going to reach maximum efficiency, and then they cannot do photosynthesis any faster. So that's why you're seeing that leveling off happening in this graph. Another thing that's going to affect photosynthesis is the levels of CO2 in your environment. So once again, we have our carbon dioxide concentration as our X, or our independent variable. We have our rate of photosynthesis as our Y, or our dependent variable. And once again, if there's no CO2, photosynthesis is not happening. CO2 is one of the reactants in photosynthesis, so if it's not there, we're not going to do any photosynthesis. And as that goes up, we are going to see an increase in the rate of photosynthesis. And then at some point, it's going to level off, because once again, there's only so much photosynthesis that each chloroplast can do, and at a certain point, it can't do it any faster. And then we have temperature. Now, this graph looks a little bit different. But on the bottom, we have temperature as our x, our independent. We have our rate of photosynthesis, once again, as our dependent y variable. And if it's really, 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 really cold, we're not going to have any photosynthesis. But as that temperature increases, we see the rate of photosynthesis going up and 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 up once again. But then it doesn't level off as the others did. It promptly drops off the edge of a cliff and photosynthesis stops happening after a certain point. And you might be asking yourself, well, why? The other ones leveled off. Think about it, you guys. If we're reaching temperatures of like 300-400 degrees, the plant's going to die. So photosynthesis is not going to continue happening at the same rate. It's going to just stop because the plant is dead. So that's why you get this upside down U happening in the temperature graph rather than just a clean leveling off as you saw in the other graphs. And then for this last part, I just kind of wanted to point out some of the leaf anatomy that you should be somewhat familiar with. We have our upper epidermis of our leaf, or our outermost portion of our leaf. And then underneath that, we have these things called our mesophyll cells or a mesophyll cell. We have a vein that's going to carry water or nutrients up and down leaves and a sheath cell surrounding that. Below that, we have our lower epidermis. And something called, what I want to draw your attention to here is our stoma. So some of you may have seen these before. You can kind of see them if you flip some leaves upside down. Stoma are actually holes in the bottom of a leaf through which plants can lose water. So in the in the water cycle, when I had you label transpiration, where plants are losing water to the atmosphere, this is where they're going to lose it through, those holes in leaves. So that's pretty much all I have to say to you today. So I hope that that was helpful. I know this video is kind of long, so I hope that you took it in chunks for yourself so as to not overwhelm yourself while you're listening to it. But if you have any questions, you feel free to ask me in class, send me an email, and have a good day.